No one shall be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall lead this people to possess the land that I swore to their ancestors to give them. Only be strong and courageous, being careful to act in accordance with all the law that my servant Moses commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, so that you may be successful wherever you go.
Hi, I'm Jacob.
Hi, I'm Nina.
Hi, I'm Mike.
And this is the Fig Tree Podcast.
So today we're talking about the book of Joshua. But before that, why don't we check in? Jacob.
Yeah, I am doing great. I had a really busy weekend, but it was really a good time. Got to do the Great Litany, which I very much enjoy doing the Great Litany. So that was my weekend.
I'm really excited because we're starting to plan the baptism of our first grandbaby, and it's just a really cool thing to be setting up the next generation.
So exciting.
It's really special.
And I got to take the whole weekend off because I was sick. And I just stayed in bed and I got better really fast because I didn't do anything.
It's funny how that works, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, we're talking about Joshua, and I think that Joshua, especially among the books of the Hebrew Bible, drives home the necessity of interpretation of the Bible. So today we'll talk about things like how history collides with the narrative of the Bible, how the Bible interprets both the past and the present, and how today we can find meaning in texts that were written so long ago. But first, let's just take a couple minutes to refresh ourselves on the story.
So Joshua picks up right after the death of Moses with the appointment of Joshua, who was betrayed as a new Moses. He does things like command Israel to follow the law, repeats the commands from Deuteronomy to take possession of the land, sends spies into the Holy Land, leads Israel through the miraculously stopped waters of the Jordan, just like Moses with the Red Sea. There's even an episode where he meets an angel and has to take off his sandals because he's standing on holy ground. Mm-hmm. That sounds familiar.
Yeah, he really does represent Moses in all of these different ways. So the story picks up after Joshua appeals to the people with the story of the spies in Jericho. And so those spies, they go into Jericho where they visit, but then are saved by a Canaanite prostitute named Rahab, who makes a pact with them to spare her and her family.
Joshua then leads the people of Israel across the Jordan, has that encounter with the angel, and then, according to God's command, processes the Ark of the Covenant around Jericho with music for 6 days. And on the 7th day, with the blast of the trumpets, the walls of Jericho came tumbling down, and Israel had victory over Jericho, destroying all the people except for Rahab and her family.
But then things go wrong.
Yep, the Israelites go to battle with another city called Ai, but they lose, and God tells them it is because they had not followed his commands about what to do with the spoils from battle. An Israelite named Achan had kept some of the items taken from Jericho for himself. So he and his family are put to death, and Joshua renews the covenant with God, and then they prevail in battle against Ai.
Mm-hmm. Then a people named the Gibeonites trick Israel, presenting themselves as a people of a different land and getting Israel to make an oath not to harm them. But after this, the book is pretty much the record of Israel conquering all the different cities in the land and then dividing up the land among the 12 tribes. And this part of the book is, I guess, really there's not another way to put it. It's brutal. The book records God commanding them to subject all the peoples they conquer to the ban, an ancient concept called cherem warfare. They're to kill everyone who does not voluntarily leave the land. That includes men, women, and children. So that's pretty tough.
Yeah, back then they had a concept of God as being a warrior.
Yeah, there's a concept in the ancient Near East that Israel is keying into of yes, Yahweh as a warrior God. Mm-hmm.
My concept of God is very different.
Yes, so we're gonna need to talk about that.
Well, there's a later Joshua that's going to come onto the scene, right?
Yeah.
And teach about the true nature of God.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, these stories have been not only can be used, but have been used in really, really bad ways. I mean, when, for example, for those of us who are from the United States, these kinds of stories in the Bible got used to justify things like manifest destiny, where the United States basically said that we had a divinely mandated destiny to be from coast to coast, and we had the right, in fact, the mandate to take all of the land from the people who are already there. And in many ways, America did kind of enact this almost total war, and through both extermination and through things like putting on reservations and such, a complete removal of the indigenous population. So these books can be used in a way that is very problematic and can justify things that are not good in our own world. So really, to talk about this book, we need to talk about how the Bible relates to actual history. So far, we've really avoided doing this, getting too caught up in these kinds of questions, because I think they tend to distract from really what is the actual point of the books. So like, for example, we didn't talk about the historicity of the Exodus because I didn't think it was relevant. But for a book like this, I think we do really have to talk about it. So what is your impression of how the Bible coincides with history? And does that present challenges for our beliefs as Christians?
Well, you always have to look at who wrote it, when they wrote it, and why they wrote it. Mm-hmm. What is the purpose of the story? It's being passed down generations to generations. What are the overarching lessons that come with this story? And there's quite a few in the book of Joshua.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you think, Mike?
I have no comment.
No comment. So I think we can say pretty confidently that the Bible is not just rote history. So everything that's recorded in the Bible, and we've kind of touched on this before, didn't necessarily happen in real history exactly the way that it's presented. Just like Mother Nina said, a lot of it is written in a theological way to where it's really trying to make a different kind of point than history. But sometimes things that are recorded in the Bible, sometimes they have a kernel of history that they're based on, but sometimes they're kind of invented wholesale. The Book of Jonah is a good example of a book that was probably completely fiction. Well, scholars think that a lot of the things in the early parts of the Hebrew Bible likely didn't happen as they were written, and they're not entirely certain about some things, but they are about as sure as they could be about the events that are recorded in the book of Joshua.
Yeah, they think that they almost certainly didn't happen. One scholar, Robert Alter, puts it this way: this book as a whole is offered as a historical account of the conquest of the land and the division of its territories, but the connection with history of both its large components is tenuous. Archaeologists in the earlier 20th century were often bent on confirming the biblical record through their discoveries, but that project has not stood the test of time. What the several last decades of archaeological investigation have established is that there was no sweeping conquest of Canaan by invaders from the east in the late 13th century BCE, which would have been the time of Joshua, and that many of the towns listed as objects of Israelite conquest were either uninhabited at this time or did not come under Israelite rule until considerably later. Jericho, the gateway town in the Jordan Valley, and the one whose conquest has become etched in collective memory was an important fortified city in the Middle Bronze Age, 2 or 3 centuries before the putative time of Joshua. But in the late 13th century, it was an abandoned site, or at most not more than a large village without walls. Lachish, another important town said to have been taken by Joshua's forces, fell under Israelite domination only during the period of the monarchy. The fact that this narrative does not correspond to what we can reconstruct of the actual history of Canaan offers one great consolation. The blood-curdling report of the massacre of the entire population of Canaanite towns, men, women, children, and in some cases livestock as well, never happened.
Well, as he says, that's kind of a relief.
It is. But if Joshua isn't talking about what actually happened, then what are we supposed to make of it all?
Well, scholars tend to see Joshua as utilizing both myth and hyperbolic language to illustrate a point. And I think maybe the best way to illustrate this would be to talk about some of our own myths. Did you know that we have myths as Americans?
Oh, yes, we
Yeah.
might.
So one of those would be, a classic example is George Washington and the cherry tree.
Yeah.
Yep, never happened. Another example is Paul Revere. Probably didn't happen. Or if it did, it didn't happen the way it was recorded to have happened. So these are examples of myths where we've kind of held up these stories that aren't necessarily true, but they're meant to capture who we are as a people. They're meant to tell us something about the United States of America.
Exactly.
So
So what is the myth of George Washington tell us? Because we keep telling that story to our kids over and over. What do we want our kids to know?
That we were founded by righteous people
Who did not lie.
who didn't lie. Yeah.
Okay.
That the ideals of our republic are founded on virtuous, truthful men. The ideas of virtuous, truthful men. But there's another myth that I think maybe illustrates this even better, and that is the myth of a certain guy named Christopher Columbus. Do you guys remember Christopher Columbus?
No, we never heard of him.
Yeah. Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. So Chris Columbus, there are certain things about his story that are true, that part. There are certain parts that are not true. For example, not everyone thought that the earth was flat. That's just not true. That being said,
It's not flat.
it's not. No, it's not. I don't know if you knew that.
It's kind of strange for a ship captain to say that, but okay, Mike, we'll just keep going here.
So Christopher Columbus, nobody really cared about him until America declared independence from Britain. And it was at that point that America, or the United States of America, needed to establish some kind of figures who weren't associated with Great Britain, who could be like these venerated figures of the past. But even more so, he gained even more popularity in the 1900s. And the reason for that is because waves of Italian immigrants were flooding into the United States in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And they needed to establish themselves as being authentically American. So they locked on to this figure of Christopher Columbus, advocated for him to have a day, for example, so that they could essentially say, hey, look, Italians can be American. They can be authentically American. And so they took this somewhat questionable figure from history and held him up as this kind of paragon of what they could be and establish their own identity that way.
So a similar thing is happening here with Joshua. So the ancient Israelites reinforced their identity with this mythic figure. And the book of Joshua drives home two main points that are really important to be passed on to future generations.
Yeah.
And that is that God is with Israel and the importance of being faithful to the covenant. that so long as Israel is obedient to the covenant, then God will protect them. And this is critically important to an Israel who's being repeatedly conquered and tossed around by their much more powerful neighbors and just enduring all that continuing trauma.
Right, right. You know, one of our mistakes in reading a book like the Book of Joshua is reading it through the lens of those who are in the United States of America. At least those of us who are here anyway, without thinking about what the experience of being an Israelite would be. So there's a scholar named Roland Faley, and he says that if the Assyrians were to destroy the northern kingdom of Israel in the 8th century BC, and Babylon were to do the same in the 6th, the reason was not military or political inferiority, but the failure of the Israelites to live as a sacred, covenanted people. He makes the point that Joshua was probably finally edited and put together at this time. And so they're essentially providing a rationale for what's happening to them.
That's a whole different way of looking at the world. So Israel is at the mercy of larger, more powerful neighbors. And so in the book of Joshua, they remember this mythical past where they, against all odds, were powerful and successful, where they were the conquerors.
Yeah. There's another scholar named Daniel Hawk, and I'm not going to read this whole quote, but he talks about how memory has a plastic quality that allows it to be reshaped and fitted into new mental molds. So he basically talks about how we can take our past experiences as individuals, but also as people, and kind of pull them together into finding new meaning. And so the book of Joshua does this. He says that Joshua does little to mute the triumphalism and brutality of Israel's memories of conquest, or to complete piecemeal remembrances of land and boundaries, yet something quite profound is accomplished in the way that these memories are connected and presented. The whole of Joshua, so the whole book, conveys a very different message than the pieces within it. With a perspective enhanced by the passage of time and meditation on life with Yahweh, the book reflects a richer understanding of what it means to be the people of God. In its final form, and I use this term advisedly, Joshua establishes a sense of identity, which demonstrates negatively that Israel cannot be defined in a fundamental sense by land, religious observance, or racial affinity, but positively that its identity at the core must be understood in light of chosenness and choosing.
So Joshua can still speak to us today then.
Yeah, Joshua is super relevant to us, but we have to read it carefully. There are, I think, 3 vignettes in the book that help us to do that.
So first, we might think about how the 2 battles at the beginning of the book illustrate a central theme, that if Israel is obedient, then God will be with them, and if they are not, then God will not.
As we said before, Israel has success with Jericho, but begins with failure when they encounter Ai.
Joshua encounters Jericho very passively. All they do is circle the city with the ark and music, and God does the rest. And then they have victory. But when they go against Ai, they fail, because one of them disobeyed God's commands. But when they return to obedience, they succeed. So over and over again in Joshua, we see this theme. Obedience means victory.
Yeah, and this relates to Israel's experience with the exile. So once we get to the prophets, we'll see that Israel interprets their conquering by Babylon and Assyria and their neighbors. They interpret this as being the result of their own disobedience. And so there's this kind of implicit message in the book of Joshua that if you obey, if you have mercy on the foreigner, if you're kind to the poor, etc., then God will have favor upon you, and this won't happen to you anymore.
So do you think this is true in our own lives? That obedience to God means success and disobedience means failure?
Well, we've talked about it a few times as we're going through here. So in my own life, like when I play God and I think I know better than God, things don't go very well. My life falls apart, and I hurt people, and it's not very good. But when I try to align my will with God's will and do what God would want me to do or not want me to do, then things seem to go way better, And so my big thing is if I stay out of God's way and let Him run the show, then I'm okay. God's got my back.
Yeah. I think it really depends on how we define success, right? Because I've heard some people say, well, if you just follow God's plan, you'll end up healthy and wealthy, and that's not necessarily true.
Nope.
No.
But inner peace is.
Exactly. Yeah. If you follow God's plan, then it goes well for you in all the ways that truly matter. Yeah.
Power, prestige, and possessions and popularity are not the goal.
Yeah. I've never heard that before. I like that. Nice little alliteration. Well, there's one very strong indication that Joshua as a whole is actually subtly undermining those stories of conquest and harem warfare. And that's our second vignette. That's the story of Rahab.
So Rahab is an unlikely hero, but the Bible's filled with those, right? She's a Canaanite prostitute, and the Israelite spies come to visit her, possibly to solicit her, but they're not supposed to do that since they weren't supposed to have anything to do with foreigners.
But then the king of Jericho orders Rahab to surrender the two men.
Ah, yes, but she lies for them, pretending she didn't know who they were and that they had left.
And the Israelites do yet another thing that they were explicitly commanded not to do, and they make a pact with the foreigner Rahab.
Well, this story is really interesting because it is so ambiguous against the very binary morality and legality of Deuteronomy. You have a prostitute, Israelite spies who visit the prostitutes, oaths being taken with foreigners, and then eventually the incorporation of a foreigner into Israel despite the command to eliminate all the people from the land.
What's really interesting to me is that what Joshua here is portraying as the exception is actually what was historically probably the norm. The people indigenous to the land were probably not mostly exterminated. Instead, they were incorporated into Israel through intermarriage and assimilation. In fact, it's very likely that Israel was something of a collection of different peoples who merged into one shared identity.
And this is really important because as we get to later parts of the Hebrew Bible, like the prophets, we will see that Israel begins incorporating this idea into their own self-understanding, seeing their vocation as mediating God's love and mercy to their neighbors. Think of the books of Jonah or Daniel, for example.
Yeah, this book, or this vignette is so good because it provides all of this wonderful ambiguity and kind of turns Joshua on its head. So what do you think we do with all of this ambiguity in the story? Like, what do we do with the prostitution and the lying and so on and so forth?
I think God likes to surprise us and turn us on our heads, right? To see the world a different way.
Yeah. It shows that God embraces the outsider too, right? Because Rahab does actually show up again after this story, doesn't she?
Yes. And so this is a confusing thing for me is that, so these are God's people and God protects these people and not these people, but they're really all God's people.
Exactly.
And we're all God's children now. So
that's right.
So this story really demonstrates the importance of reading the Hebrew Bible and the entire Bible through the lens of Jesus.
Exactly. Yeah. We so often misunderstand God, and it's very easy for us to interpret stories like Joshua in a way. In fact, we are so tempted to interpret them in a way that permits us to engage in the things we already want to do, right? Like violence and hatred of other peoples.
But Jesus shows us that we always have to interpret through the lens of the love of God that Jesus revealed to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a scholar that I really like. His name's Walter Wink, and he talks about twisted images of God that portray God as being violent and bloodthirsty. He's especially in this quote talking about ways of interpreting the crucifixion. And he remarks that against such an image of God, the revolt of atheism is an act of our religion. That's an intense quote. And he says, by contrast, the God whom Jesus reveals refrains from all forms of reprisal and demands no victims. God does not endorse holy wars or just wars or religions of violence. Only by being driven out by violence could God signal to humanity that the divine is non-violent and is antithetical to the kingdom of violence. Jesus' message reveals that those who believe in divine violence are still mired in Satan's universe. To be this God's offspring means the complete and definitive elimination of every form of violence between individuals and nations.
And we've heard this from many people in our history, right? History of the world. I'm thinking of Gandhi right now, Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah.
The church fathers, as well as many Jewish interpreters like Philo, often understood the Hebrew Bible and the stories of God in it to need to be interpreted spiritually and typologically and not literally. Joshua works really well when interpreted this way.
Mm-hmm. I really like a quote from Gregory of Nyssa, and he talks about in his treatise on baptism. He says that you have been for a long time wallowing in the mud. Hasten to the Jordan, not at the call of John, but at the voice of Christ. In fact, the river of grace runs everywhere. It doesn't rise in Palestine to disappear into the neighboring sea, but it envelops the entire world and plunges itself into paradise, flowing against the course of the 4 rivers which come down from thence, and carrying back into paradise things far more precious than those which came out. For those rivers brought sweet perfumes and the cultivation and insemination of the earth. But this river brings back men born of the Holy Spirit. So imitate Jesus, the son of Nave, Jesus, Joshua. Carry the gospel as he carried the ark. Leave the desert, that is to say, sin. Cross the Jordan. Hasten towards the life according to Christ, towards the earth which bears the fruits of joy, where run, according to the promise, streams of milk and honey. Overthrow Jericho, the old dwelling place. Do not leave it fortified. All these things are a figure, a typos of ourselves. All are prefigurations of realities which are now made manifest. So do you see what he's doing? He's connecting the story of Joshua to the whole story of the Christian life.
Exactly. We follow the story in our own lives, the choices, the steps that we take every day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when we're talking about like things like the conquering of cities and all of that, that's not very compelling if you're interpreting it literally. But if you're interpreting it spiritually, taking principles like God is with us and God wants us to drive out those things which God doesn't want within us, for example, then we're really cooking with gas.
Like walls around our heart?
Exactly. Yeah. Mike, I feel like you have something to say about that.
I love that I could have this sinful and destructive nature, and that God never leaves me, and that he's always holding me in his arms, and just what a great, sweet embrace it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't have to go to war to kill anyone, to be the conqueror.
Amen to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks for listening to the Fig Tree Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing this podcast on social media so others can join us. We hope that you have a great day, and we'll see you next time on the Fig Tree Podcast.